chapter where we find this parable about the unforgiving debtor. When you read this chapter, a lot depends on the translation in which you read it, and a lot depends on the tone of voice in which you read it. A lot depends on the prejudices that you bring to it. If you read this chapter through the glasses of someone who has been taught that God is a harsh, demanding, just personification of justice, you will miss the points. You will miss the points. There are some words in the chapter that sound hard. And those who like to preach a hard message make the most of it. But I want to suggest to you that you look at the whole chapter in the light of what you know about God from our years of studying the Bible together, that God is good. The primary and most important thing we can say about God is that God is love, and that God is lovable. And that image is, in this chapter, personified by Jesus as he is dealing with his disciples and with the children, and by the king in the parable that he tells. What could be nicer than a king who forgives a great debt? Remember that this king is the one who forgives the great debt. The rest of it, let's try to see. Oh, I wish we had 2 hours for this, but we don't. And I won't take 2 hours. I may get to a certain point, Ross, I'm going to have to finish this next week, but let's do our best. First of all, the context of the chapter includes the whole Bible, and specifically it includes the whole Gospel of Matthew, and even more immediately it includes the 17th chapter. In the 17th chapter, we have the story of the Transfiguration. Jesus goes up on the mountain with Peter, James, and John, and they see Moses and Elijah and Jesus transfigured in glory, and they are very, very excited. The other 9 disciples are down below. And they have a bad experience that day. A man brings a child to them and they can't cure him. And they do their best and nothing happens. Jesus comes down with Peter, James, and John. And they say, why couldn't we heal him? Well, Jesus heals the child. And that's wonderful. Then he tells them, at the conclusion of that, when they say, why couldn't we do it? He said, because you have so little faith. It's because you have so little faith. Jesus never plays the silly tact game. Well, fellas, I'm glad you gave it a good try. I mean, forget that. He doesn't talk like that. He says, you have so little faith. He just tells them to help them. And he says, in truth, I tell you, if your faith were the size of a mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. Now that's the kind of outrageous claim that people of every other religion should be making, should be bringing to our attention if we start telling them about Jesus. They say, oh yeah, I know, you're the people that Jesus told nothing would be impossible for you. Let me see you move a mountain. And we don't have that kind of power, do we? Now, what are we going to do? We're going to say, well, God didn't really mean it, or, well, God has let us down, or there's some things we have yet to learn. You have a choice, and that's the choice we have to make. We have to say, no, it's not God's fault. Jesus' promises are absolutely reliable. It is true. I want you to realize this. Put it in your mind, in a prominent place where you won't lose it. If you had faith like a mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it would move. Nothing will be impossible for you. There are other places where he says nothing is impossible with God. Here he says nothing is impossible, will be impossible for you. For you. I want the children to remember that. I want the old folks to remember that. I want everybody of all ages to remember that. We are people to whom God has made this promise and made this offer and provided this resource. And you know perfectly well that I'm not preaching down my nose at you here. I've told you many times, every Sunday morning there are two sermons, the one I hear and the one you hear. The one I hear is always better and stronger. And it's saying to me, why aren't you there yet? And I have to make my confessions and make my prayers and make my efforts, make my resolves, my resolutions. Well, when they were together in Galilee, right after this, Jesus says, now people are not going to accept this. They're going to take me, arrest me, and kill me. And that's all they heard. But that's not all he said. He said they will put him to death, and on the third day he will be raised up again. On the third day he will be raised up again. They didn't hear that. A great sadness came over them because they heard he was going to be killed. And they couldn't take that in about the power. Like the power of moving mountains and the power of rising from the dead. Couldn't take that in. Then they got to Capernaum, and Peter was approached by somebody about taxes. And Jesus said to him, do kings receive taxes or do they pay taxes? Oh, he said, kings receive taxes. Well then, should I be paying taxes since I'm here as the king, offering the kingdom to Israel? But go ahead, so we don't have any trouble with the people now. Go fishing. And the first fish you get will have a coin in its mouth, which will be just the right amount to pay the tax. Greatest miracle in the Bible, I sometimes think. You've heard fish stories. You have never heard a fish story like that. And one, you know, it isn't just some guy saying, oh, I caught a fish with a coin in its mouth. We're talking about the Babe Ruth Homer, where he says, up there, and then hits it up there. There will be a fish with that coin in its mouth, first one you cast. Now we come to chapter 18. And the disciples, guess why? From chapter 17, can you understand this? They're arguing about which one of them is the greatest. 9 of them couldn't do squat, you know, when the man brought his son, right? The 3 of them come down. We've been up on the mountain with Jesus. We saw Moses and Elijah. They're arguing about which would be the greatest. Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? They come to Jesus and ask. Now what he does is interesting. He doesn't just say, well, a little child and all that. He calls a child. And then he sets the child down right there among them. You have to remember that children were not highly regarded in that society. We've already seen that from other occasions. When the children come around and want to get to Jesus, the disciples say, whoa, we don't know. He calls a child, sets him down here among them. And then he says, verily, in truth, amen, in Greek, which is a Greek version of the Hebrew word, I believe this, and you should believe this. It's from the Hebrew root to believe. Believe it. I'm telling you something. Unless you change. And this is said to all 12 of them. All 12, Peter, James, and John, and the 9 who had trouble. Unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Never mind who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. You'll never get in unless you change.